Looking back, I think the relationship had been ending for about 4 months before either of us said anything out loud. That's not unusual. Most things end well before the moment that gets remembered as the ending. There's a long middle period where both people know, in the private way you know things you're not ready to act on, and life continues in the space between the knowing and the saying. Groceries get bought, plans get made. Someone asks, "What do you want for dinner?" And the other person answers, and neither of them mentions the thing living in the room with them. We were good at that. Better than most, I think. Her name was Selen. We'd been together for 2 years, lived together for 7 months, and somewhere in those 7 months, something had shifted in a way I couldn't locate precisely. Not a single moment, more like a season changing. You don't see autumn arrive, you just notice one morning that the light is different. She mentioned Marcus, the ex, more than she used to. Casually. The way you mention someone when you're testing whether they'll be mentioned. I registered it each time and filed it without comment, which was either maturity or cowardice, and I was never sure which. There were other things. Small recalibrations in how she occupied the apartment. A little more separate, a little less present, as if she was already beginning the process of becoming a person who lived elsewhere. I noticed. I said nothing. I am good at noticing and saying nothing. It is not always a virtue. She said it on a Tuesday. We were in the kitchen. She was leaning against the counter with her coffee, and I was doing something at the table. I don't remember what, something ordinary. And she said it in the tone of someone who has rehearsed it enough that the rehearsal has worn off, and what remains is just the flat fact of it. I need you to decide by the weekend, commit properly, or I'm going back to Marcus. I looked up. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it enough to know. It wasn't panic. It wasn't the lurch of someone who suddenly sees what they're about to lose. It was something quieter and stranger than that. Something almost like relief, except relief implies you've been holding your breath, and I hadn't known I was holding it until just then. What I said was, "All right, I'll go buy the ring." She smiled. The smile of someone who has played a hand and watched it land. She set down her coffee, said something light about finally, and the conversation moved on. I let it move on. But the relief was still there, sitting in my chest like a question I hadn't asked yet. She left that afternoon. She said she was meeting a friend, which was technically not a lie, and was also not the truth, and I understood both things without saying either. I watched her go. Stood at the window for a moment after the door closed. Then I started packing her things. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it matters that you understand what it was and wasn't. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't calculated to wound her or to demonstrate something. It was, and I know how this sounds, the most honest thing I'd done in months. I moved through the apartment and gathered what was hers, and I did it slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that used to matter. There wasn't much. 7 months of cohabitation, and there wasn't much. That fact arrived with its own weight, and I let it. I stacked it near the front door. A bag, a box, a few things I set carefully on top. Then I sat down and wrote the note. I've had people ask me what it said. Friends later, when the story got told in pieces, they expected something pointed, something designed to land. A final word sharpened into a verdict. It wasn't that. I wrote 4 sentences. I've reconstructed them close enough. I did love you. I don't think that was ever the question, but when you left this afternoon, I noticed I wasn't afraid, and I've been thinking about what that means. I think it means we already knew. That was all. I didn't mention Marcus, didn't reference the ultimatum. Didn't explain the bags because the bags were self-explanatory and she deserved the dignity of not having things explained to her like a lesson. I put the note on top of the box, moved everything into the hallway outside the apartment door, and went back inside. Then I made dinner, ate it alone, and watched something on television that I don't remember, and the evening passed away. Evenings passed when something significant has happened and the world doesn't adjust its pace to acknowledge it. I found out about Marcus later. Not that night, not from her. What I know is this. She had gone expecting something, and what she found was different from what she'd expected, in the way that people kept at a distance for long enough eventually become honest about that distance when directly approached. He had moved on, or had never been as available as the idea of him, or both. I don't know the specifics, I didn't ask for them. What I know is that she came back to the apartment at 9:30, and I heard her before I saw her, the sound of her key in the lock, then the particular silence of someone who has opened a door and found something they didn't anticipate. I heard her in the hallway. I sat where I was. It was maybe 3 minutes before she knocked. I opened the door. She'd been crying. Genuinely, the kind of crying that doesn't clean up quickly. She was holding the note. Not dramatically, not as an offering. Just holding it, the way you hold something you've read several times and are still reading. She said, "Can I come in?" I stepped back from the door. She came in and stood in the middle of the living room and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not guilt exactly, more like the face of someone who has arrived somewhere they didn't intend and recognizes the territory anyway. I didn't say anything. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because it was something to do and because I genuinely didn't know what the next sentence was. She sat on the couch. I could hear her breathing from the kitchen. When I brought the tea out, she was still holding the note. "You moved everything outside," she said. "Yes. Were you going to bring it back in if I don't know," I said. Which was true. I hadn't thought that far. She nodded. Looked at the tea. "I didn't go to see him to hurt you," she said. "I know, I went because I was." She stopped, started again. "I don't know what I was doing." I believed that. It was probably the most honest thing she'd said in months, which is the kind of observation I kept to myself. We sat in the particular silence of two people who are not fighting, which is sometimes harder than fighting because there's nothing to push against, just the open space of what's true which doesn't argue back. She asked me what the note meant. I told her it meant what it said. That the absence of fear had told me something I'd needed to know. That I wasn't ending things to punish her. That I'd ended things because standing in the kitchen after she left, I'd felt the shape of what we'd become, and it wasn't what either of us deserved. She said, "But you said you'd buy the ring." "I know. Did you mean it?" I thought about that honestly. I think I meant it the way you mean things when you're trying to avoid knowing something. I said it so I wouldn't have to feel what I felt when you walked out the door. She was quiet for a long time. Then, "What did you feel?" "Nothing," I said. That was the problem. She didn't leave that night. She slept in the bedroom and I slept on the couch, and in the morning I brought her coffee without discussion, because whatever was broken between us didn't change the fact that I was capable of the gesture and she was in the apartment, and it cost me nothing. She left mid-morning. Her things were still in the hall. She took them. At the door she turned and looked at me for a moment, looking for something I think, or looking to leave something, and then she said, "The note was kind." I said, "I meant it to be." She nodded. And then she left. There's a version of this story where I tell you I felt victorious, where the packing of the bags and the waiting and the opening of the door is constructed as a win. A lesson talked, a point made, a man who played it correctly and watched the board fall his way. That's not what it was. What it was this: a Tuesday that asked a question I didn't know I'd already answered, a hallway and a box and a note that tried to be honest. A woman crying on a couch who had made several bad calculations and arrived at consequences sooner than expected, and who was not a villain for it, just a person who had stopped being sure and handled the uncertainty badly. I'd handled things badly too. 4 months of knowing and saying nothing is its own kind of failure. We were two people who had run out of the thing that makes ordinary life between two people bearable, and neither of us had said so, and the ultimatum was her version of forcing the question, and the bags in the hallway were mine. Different methods. Same conclusion. A mutual friend asked me a few weeks later whether I regretted it. I thought about it properly before answering, which I think is the only honest way to answer that question. What I said was, I regret that it went the way it went. I don't regret where it ended up. He nodded like that made sense. I think it does. The two things can be true. You can wish the road had been smoother and still be glad you're where you are. You can feel something genuine for a person, and also know that what you felt had reached its natural limit, and that the limit was not a failure but just the shape of that particular love. She texted once, about a month later. Something brief, not asking for anything, just a checking in. I replied with equal brevity. We didn't speak again after that. The apartment felt different for a while. Then it felt like mine. That, as much as anything, is what I was trying to give both of us. Room to feel like ourselves again, separately, in whatever spaces we were moving toward. I hope she found hers. I'm still finding mine, which is fine. That's how it usually goes.